Black woman CEO goes undercover at her dealership. White client tries to kick her out and regrets it. In the busy world of car dealerships, the CEO of one of the most successful dealerships in the city, a black woman, had seen and experienced a lot. She had spent years building her business from scratch, navigating the ups and downs of the industry, and fighting hard for the success she had achieved. But despite her position, she always felt there were aspects of her business she couldn't fully see, especially how her employees and customers truly viewed her. For years, she had been at the helm of the company, making decisions, managing employees, and overseeing the daily operations. The dealership had grown under her leadership, but she still felt like something was missing. The CEO knew the reality of racism, how it could lurk beneath the surface in even the most polished of environments. She also knew that her leadership, as a black woman in an industry where white men often dominated, could be met with unconscious biases or outright prejudice, even if those things weren't always visible. Her curiosity began to grow. How would people treat her if they didn't know who she really was? How would her employees act if they didn't know their boss was standing right in front of them? How would customers respond to her, especially if they assumed she wasn't in charge? The thought of going undercover, slipping into the role of a regular customer, seemed like the only way to answer these questions. She realized that to truly understand the internal workings of her business, to grasp what needed to change, and to see what her employees and customers were really like, she would need to experience it firsthand, without anyone knowing who she was. But the decision wasn't easy. As a successful CEO, she had worked hard for her position. Her public image was everything. She had spent years building a reputation, earning the trust of her employees, and developing relationships with customers. What if going undercover damaged that? What if people found out later and felt betrayed? However, the CEO knew she had to take this risk. She had always believed in leading by example, in being honest and open. But in order to make real, meaningful change within her dealership, she needed to see the truth, the kind of truth that couldn't be filtered by anyone's perception of her status. So, she made the decision. She would put on a disguise, change her appearance, and step into the shoes of an ordinary customer. No one would know who she was. Her employees wouldn't recognize her, and neither would the customers. She was ready to see her dealership from a fresh perspective. She spent days preparing for her undercover visit. Her disguise had to be perfect, and she carefully planned out every detail. She decided to dress casually, nothing too flashy or attention-grabbing. She chose simple clothing, jeans and a hoodie, an outfit that would make her blend into the crowd without standing out. She even practiced her walk and mannerisms to make sure she didn't draw any unnecessary attention to herself. On the day she decided to go undercover, she felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. There was a lot riding on this experiment. She couldn't help but wonder how people would treat her, how her employees would react to her when they didn't know who she was. She was also curious to see how her customers would respond to her. Would they treat her with respect, or would they judge her based on her appearance? As she entered the dealership, she took a deep breath. Everything around her seemed so familiar, yet so different. The showroom was bustling with activity. Employees were talking to customers, answering questions, and guiding them to various vehicles. The CEO observed quietly from the back, watching everything unfold. It felt strange to be anonymous in a place she had built from the ground up, but at the same time, it gave her a sense of freedom. She moved through the showroom, trying to stay unnoticed, yet soaking in everything she could. There was a subtle tension in the air, one that she hadn't expected. The way some of the staff interacted with customers seemed overly friendly, but their eyes flickered nervously when they spoke with her. She noticed that when a few of the male employees looked her way, their smiles were more reserved. There was a sense of distance that wasn't there when they spoke with others. Was it because of her appearance, or was it something else? The CEO found herself intrigued by these little interactions. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the body language was telling. She moved toward the area where the sales staff were assisting clients, hoping to engage in some casual conversation. As she approached, she overheard a conversation between two salespeople. One was speaking to a customer with great enthusiasm, while the other was barely acknowledging her presence. The salesperson who had been speaking to the customer gave the CEO a brief nod but didn't offer to help her. Instead, he quickly moved to assist another customer. It wasn't an obvious snub, but the dismissive attitude lingered. The CEO felt the sting of being overlooked, but she reminded herself that this was exactly why she had decided to go undercover. She needed to understand these dynamics. She needed to witness the subtleties that often went unnoticed. As she continued to walk through the dealership, the CEO observed her staff's interactions. She watched how they treated customers, how some were quick to greet and assist, while others barely acknowledged the presence of certain clients. There was a certain hesitation in the air when it came to her. Some employees were simply too polite to speak up, while others treated her like she wasn't important enough to assist. By the time she reached the showroom's luxury car section, the CEO had gathered a fair amount of information. She had seen enough to realize that her employees weren't always aware of the subtle biases that influenced their behavior. There was no doubt in her mind that there was work to be done, but the real test was still to come. The most important part of the undercover experience had yet to unfold. She had seen the interactions with her staff, but how would the customers react when they didn't know who she was? Would they treat her differently based on her appearance? With a steady heart and clear purpose, she waited for the next opportunity to interact with a customer, ready to face whatever came next. As the CEO of the dealership continued to blend into the background, she couldn't help but notice more details about how things were. Running, things she'd never have seen if she were walking through her dealership as the CEO. Now, behind the scenes and unrecognized, she had an entirely new perspective on what was really happening at her business. What she saw wasn't necessarily what she had hoped for, but it was something she needed to witness for herself. As she walked through the showroom, she tried to keep her movements casual, pretending to be just another customer browsing the cars. The air felt different, less comfortable, more transactional. She realized that, as the owner, she had always tried to maintain a friendly and approachable environment. But in this role, where no one knew who she was, things were different. It was as if there was a shift in the energy. Her first stop was by a group of employees who were engaged in a conversation with a couple of potential buyers. One of the employees, a young man, was speaking animatedly with the couple, gesturing toward a high-end car. His tone was warm and his body language was open, clearly trying to make a sale. The CEO observed closely, impressed by the salesman's charm and professionalism. But as she moved closer, she noticed a subtle shift. The salesman's mood seemed to change when he noticed her. He stopped making eye contact and instead focused on his customers, his tone becoming more stiff and formal. The CEO noticed that the other employees weren't much different. Some gave her a polite nod as she passed by, but none seemed eager to offer help. They were busy focusing their attention on other customers, customers who didn't look like her. It wasn't as if they were rude, but their indifference stood out. It was as if she had become invisible to them. She stood there for a moment, wondering if it was just in her head, but the feeling was undeniable. It wasn't just the staff. The customers themselves seemed to behave differently, too. As she wandered through the showroom, the CEO couldn't help but overhear some of their conversations. A couple of men were standing next to a sleek sports car, their voices low but full of judgment. They glanced at her once, but when their eyes met, they looked away quickly. The CEO caught a few snatches of their conversation, and she realized they were making assumptions about her. She wasn't being treated as a potential customer. Instead, she was being dismissed, as if she wasn't worthy of the same attention that others received. At that moment, she couldn't help but reflect on the way her dealership had built its reputation. She had worked hard to create an environment where everyone felt welcome, where the focus was on professionalism and customer satisfaction. But now, in this anonymous role, she was starting to see cracks in that illusion. It was subtle, but it was there. The CEO realized that there was a part of her business that needed to change. It wasn't just about her employees and customers. The way the dealership itself operated, its culture, the subtle biases, was becoming clearer. She had created a space that in many ways was still falling short. There was an unspoken hierarchy within the dealership, and while no one would admit it, the truth was there in how people treated each other. Some customers got more attention, more warmth, more effort. Others, like herself, were brushed aside. The CEO had always believed that her dealership was inclusive, that it embraced diversity and provided excellent service to everyone, no matter their background. But as she stood there in the middle of the showroom, she was confronted with the truth. Even the best businesses could have hidden problems that needed addressing. Her experience wasn't just about seeing how others treated her, it was also about seeing how her employees treated each other. The atmosphere seemed charged, almost tense. The CEO had always pushed her employees to work together as a team, but now she wondered if some of them were acting out of a sense of discomfort, maybe even fear. As she observed, she saw an employee hesitating to speak up in front of the rest of the staff. Another quietly complained about how one of the managers was too demanding. And yet, no one seemed willing to voice their concerns directly. It was as if the lines of communication were clogged and employees were too hesitant to speak their minds. At one point, she found herself standing near a coffee station where a few of her senior staff members were chatting. They seemed friendly enough, but when she caught snippets of their conversation, she realized that some of the things they were talking about weren't exactly in line with the values she had tried to instill in the dealership. One of them made a comment about a customer who was hard to please. The tone was dismissive, as if the customer wasn't worth the time or effort. The CEO couldn't help but feel disappointed. It was moments like these that reflected the true culture of the workplace, small, seemingly harmless comments that, when added together, shaped the environment. As the day went on, the CEO's sense of disillusionment grew. She had been hoping for a smooth, undercover experience, one that would confirm everything she thought about her dealership. But the reality was far from what she expected. Her employees weren't as engaged as she had hoped. They weren't as aware of the subtle biases that influenced their actions. And worst of all, the customers weren't treated equally. There was a line, and some people were on one side of it while others were left out. It was a pattern she couldn't ignore. Despite the growing disappointment, she reminded herself that this experience wasn't about condemnation. It was about understanding and discovering the areas that needed work. As uncomfortable as it was, the CEO knew this was the only way to bring about real change. She had to confront the uncomfortable truths if she wanted to transform her dealership into a space where everyone, employees and customers alike, felt truly valued. As the day came to a close, the CEO reflected on what she had learned so far. There was still much to uncover, but she had already gathered valuable insights. She was starting to see how people, her employees, her customers, even herself, were shaped by their own biases, whether conscious or not. The experience was an eye-opener, one that would guide her as she worked toward making her dealership a more inclusive and welcoming space for everyone. As the undercover CEO continued her walk through the dealership, the atmosphere around her seemed to shift. She could feel the weight of the underlying tension that had been building since she first entered. The salespeople were busy, some enthusiastically engaging with customers, others more distracted, but none paying her much attention. That was when she noticed a well-dressed man walking toward her, his eyes scanning the showroom floor as he made his way to the luxury car section. He was tall, with a confident stride that suggested he was someone used to getting what he wanted. The CEO couldn't help but observe the way he looked at the cars, not just as a potential buyer, but as someone who expected the best, someone who was accustomed to being treated with respect. He walked right past her without so much as a glance. She wasn't surprised. After all, she was just an ordinary customer in this role, and she was used to being overlooked by the salespeople. However, she could sense the difference when he arrived at the sales counter, where one of her employees was already assisting another client. The employee greeted the man with a smile that was warmer and more genuine than any she had received that day. The CEO watched, not just as an observer, but as someone who had worked hard to create a welcoming environment for all customers. The exchange between the employee and the client was polite but unmistakably deferential, as though the man was being given special treatment. Then, as the man turned to examine one of the luxury vehicles, he caught the CEO's gaze. His eyes flickered over her, and for a brief moment he hesitated. It was a subtle shift, but it was there. His demeanor changed. There was a slight frown, then a deep, calculating look, as if he was trying to place her, wondering who she was and why she seemed out of place. To him, she must have looked like just another customer, someone not worth his attention or respect. And that's when it happened. The man made a remark loud enough for her to hear, addressing the sales associate who was assisting him. "I don't know why she's even here," he said with an air of arrogance. "A place like this should have people who know what they're doing, not someone like her." The words hit the CEO like a slap in the face, but she didn't flinch. She stood still, forcing herself to breathe deeply. She realized with a shock that the man had assumed she was unqualified, just based on her appearance. In his eyes, she wasn't supposed to be in a dealership like this, where high-end cars were sold to those with means. His assumptions had been quick, and the judgment was instantaneous. What he didn't know was that the CEO was the very person who owned this dealership. She was the one who had worked tirelessly to build this business from the ground up. And yet here she was, invisible to him, dismissed because of his own biases. For a moment, she thought about revealing who she was, about stopping the interaction right there and confronting the man about his ignorance. But she held back. This wasn't the time for confrontation, at least not yet. She had a bigger goal in mind, to understand how deeply these prejudices ran, to see firsthand how people like him treated others when they thought no one was watching. The sales associate, who had overheard the comment, looked visibly uncomfortable, but didn't say anything. He seemed caught between his duty to the customer and his own discomfort with the situation. The CEO could see that he was trying to manage the tension, but the awkwardness in the air was palpable. It wasn't just about the client's rude remark. It was about the power dynamic, the way this client felt entitled to speak down to her, and how everyone around her seemed to accept it without challenge. The CEO tried to stay calm. She could feel the anger rising inside her, but she knew that getting upset wouldn't help. Instead, she reminded herself that this moment, though painful, was part of the larger process. This was exactly why she had gone undercover in the first place, to see this kind of behavior firsthand and understand how it shaped the culture of her dealership. As the man continued to examine the car, the CEO walked toward the other side of the showroom, trying to shake off the sting of his words. She was still reeling from the encounter, but she couldn't let it distract her from her mission. She was here to see the truth. She needed to stay focused, to learn what was really happening in her dealership when no one knew she was the owner. But the encounter didn't end there. A few minutes later, as the man was getting ready to leave, he turned and saw the CEO again, standing near a different display. This time, there was a moment of realization in his eyes. He didn't know why, but something about her had started to seem familiar. The CEO could see the confusion crossing his face as he tried to piece things together. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than before, and she knew in that instant that he was starting to figure out who she really was. At that moment, the CEO's heart was pounding. She could feel the shift in the air. The man approached her, his expression changing from casual arrogance to something softer, more guarded. "Excuse me," he said, his voice now hesitant. I didn't mean to be rude earlier." The CEO took a deep breath. She didn't say anything right away, but instead, she gave him a steady look. His apology was almost apologetic, but she didn't know whether it was genuine or simply a response to the discomfort of realizing he had been rude to the dealership owner. "It's all right," the CEO finally said, her voice calm and composed. "You just assumed I didn't belong here, didn't you?" The man looked taken aback, clearly uncomfortable. He shifted his weight, unsure of how to respond. There was a long pause before he finally mumbled, I didn't know who you were. I apologize. I was out of line." The CEO nodded, keeping her voice neutral. "You were," she said simply before walking away. There was nothing more to say. She could tell that the man regretted his words, but the damage had already been done. This moment, this encounter, had shown her everything she needed to know. The biases were there in full force. The assumptions people made about her, based solely on her appearance, were real. But now she had the truth. The man had apologized, but his initial reaction had revealed something far more important: how deeply ingrained these prejudices were and how quickly they could shape someone's behavior. As she walked away, the CEO's thoughts were swirling. She had seen it for herself, the discrimination, the judgment, the power dynamics at play. But she wasn't going to let this setback define her. Instead, she was more determined than ever to change things. The dealership had come a long way, but it wasn't perfect. There was work to do, and this experience had given her the clarity she needed to begin the process of change. The CEO's heart was still racing as she walked away from the encounter with the white client. She felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, disbelief, but also a deep sense of clarity. In that moment, she knew that what had happened wasn't just a one-off situation. It was a reflection of something bigger, something that went beyond one interaction or one man. The biases, the assumptions, the subtle but powerful judgments, these were ingrained in the culture of the dealership. She had seen it with her own eyes, but she wasn't going to let this experience defeat her. She had to confront it. She had to address it, not just for herself, but for the future of her business. She wasn't sure how she was going to do it yet, but she knew that this was the moment where change had to begin. A few minutes later, as the man was getting ready to leave the dealership, the CEO found herself standing near the entrance, trying to compose herself. She had gathered herself enough to walk confidently across the showroom floor, but she still felt a tightness in her chest from the confrontation. She hadn't expected the day to take such a turn, but she was now determined to face this head-on. That's when the man walked past her again. His steps were slower now, and his gaze shifted nervously toward her. The CEO could sense his hesitation. He knew he had done something wrong, but he wasn't sure how to make it right. It wasn't just guilt that clouded his expression. It was embarrassment. He had judged her, dismissed her, and now he had realized that she was the very person who owned the place. He had assumed that someone like her couldn't belong in this space, and the realization was beginning to sink in. The man stopped in his tracks and turned toward her. For a brief moment, the CEO considered walking away, but she knew that would only make him feel more uncomfortable. She knew he was going to apologize, but she needed him to understand why his actions had been hurtful. She wasn't looking for an apology just to smooth things over. She needed him to confront his own biases and take responsibility for his behavior. I owe you an apology, the man started, his voice sounding smaller than before. His words were hesitant, as if he was struggling to find the right way to express his regret. I didn't know who you were. I was completely out of line earlier. I shouldn't have said what I did. The CEO didn't rush to respond. She simply stood there, waiting for him to continue, giving him the space to realize the weight of his words. There was a long silence, and she could see the man shifting uncomfortably. He seemed to be searching for the right words, but he wasn't sure how to make it right. Finally, he looked at her directly, and his gaze softened. I just assumed that you were just another customer, he said, his tone quieter now. I didn't mean to disrespect you, and I feel terrible about it. I can't believe I acted that way. The CEO nodded slowly, letting his words sink in. She could see that he was genuinely sorry, but there was also a sense of discomfort in the way he was speaking. His apology wasn't just about the words. It was about the realization of his own bias, something he hadn't even realized was there until now. He was coming to terms with how quickly he had judged her, based solely on her appearance, and how easily he had dismissed her as unworthy of respect. She didn't rush to forgive him. She didn't need to. The apology was the first step, but it was only a small part of the larger picture. The CEO took a deep breath, maintaining her calm composure. What you said earlier wasn't just wrong, she began, her voice steady. It was disrespectful. Not just to me, but to anyone who might look like me, or anyone who might not fit your idea of who belongs in a place like this. She paused, letting her words settle. She could see the man's expression shift again, this time toward understanding. He was listening now, really hearing her. People like you, the CEO continued, assume things about people like me all the time. You think you know what I'm capable of based on how I look or what I'm wearing or maybe even what I drive. But you don't. And neither do the people who work here. The man swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable, but understanding that he needed to hear this. He nodded, looking down at his feet for a moment, as if trying to gather his thoughts. I didn't see it that way. I never thought about it like that, he admitted, looking up at her again. I was wrong, and I realize that now. The CEO's gaze softened, but she didn't let the man off easily. This was a moment for reflection for both of them. I hope this experience will help you think about how you treat people in the future, she said quietly. Because it's not just about me, it's about everyone. We all deserve respect, regardless of who we are or what we look like. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The dealership had become quiet, and the tension in the air was palpable. The CEO could feel the weight of the moment, but she also knew that this was exactly what needed to happen. This wasn't just about her. This was about challenging the assumptions and biases that shaped how people interacted with each other every day. Finally, the man cleared his throat and extended his hand. I really am sorry. And I hope you can accept my apology, he said, his voice sincere. The CEO glanced at his hand but didn't immediately shake it. She wasn't sure if that was necessary. Instead, she simply nodded. "I accept your apology," she said calmly. "But it's not just about words, it's about actions. I want to see you do better next time." The man stood there for a moment longer before nodding and walking away, his head lowered in thought. The CEO watched him leave, feeling a mix of emotions. She wasn't sure if he would truly change or if he would just forget about this encounter, but she hoped that something in him had shifted. As she stood there in the showroom, she reflected on what had just transpired. It was uncomfortable but necessary. She had faced the prejudice head-on, and while the man had apologized, the real work was just beginning. This experience, painful as it was, had opened her eyes even more to the biases that existed, not just in the world but within her own business. She knew that there was still so much to do to create a truly inclusive environment at her dealership. But now, with the truth laid bare, she felt more determined than ever to push for change. This was just the beginning. And she was ready to take the next steps. As the day wore on, the CEO couldn't shake the conversation with the white client from her mind. It replayed over and over in her thoughts, his words, his apology, and the way the whole situation had unfolded. She had entered the dealership that morning as an undercover customer, hoping to learn more about the business she had worked so hard to build. What she had discovered, however, had been far more revealing than she expected. She had uncovered not just flaws in her dealership, but also in herself. The truth hit her hard, and yet she understood that this discomfort was part of the journey. As a leader, she had always prided herself on maintaining an open mind and fostering a welcoming environment. But now she saw that even with all her efforts, there was still much more work to be done. The biases she had witnessed, both from her employees and the customers, were real and powerful, and they weren't just a reflection of the world outside her business. They were present in her dealership, too. She sat in the quiet of her office, staring out the window at the busy lot, the sun slowly setting in the distance. Her thoughts were scattered, trying to piece together everything she had experienced. She had built this business with hard work and determination, but the foundation wasn't as solid as she thought. There were cracks, hidden ones, that needed to be addressed before she could move forward. She reflected on her encounter with the white client. His actions, though rude and hurtful, had opened her eyes. The reality was that the world and her business was not as inclusive as she had believed. The assumption that someone like her couldn't belong in a space like this wasn't just a flaw in that man's thinking. It was a flaw in the industry at large. It was a reminder that even those who appeared to be progressive or open-minded could still harbor biases, whether consciously or unconsciously. The CEO knew that this moment of confrontation, though difficult, had been necessary. It had revealed the deep-seated issues that existed in her dealership, but more importantly, it had given her the chance to address them. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine. She had seen firsthand how people were treated based on their appearance, their race, their assumptions. And now, more than ever, she knew that her dealership had to change, not just in policy but in practice. But the work wouldn't be easy. She couldn't fix everything overnight, and she knew that change would take time. The biases she had witnessed were ingrained, not just in the customers but in the culture of her employees as well. It would require more than just training or a few policy changes. It would require a fundamental shift in the way her dealership operated, a shift that started with her. She thought about her employees. She had always believed in fostering a positive work environment, one where everyone felt valued and respected. But what about the subtle dynamics that shaped how her employees interacted with each other and with customers? Had she overlooked these issues in her drive for success? Had she been so focused on the big picture that she failed to see the small, everyday moments that were contributing to the problem? The CEO knew that it was time to have honest conversations with her team, conversations that went beyond surface-level pleasantries. She needed to create a space where her employees felt comfortable sharing their thoughts and concerns, where they could openly discuss issues like bias, privilege, and inclusion. These weren't easy topics, but they were necessary ones. She had to lead by example, showing her team that no conversation was off-limits if it meant creating a better, more inclusive environment for everyone. But it wasn't just about her employees. The customers were another piece of the puzzle. How could she ensure that they felt respected and valued, no matter who they were or where they came from? The dealership needed to implement policies that fostered inclusivity. But it also needed to create an atmosphere where customers felt welcome from the moment they stepped foot on the lot. That meant addressing the biases and assumptions that some of the customers held, like the white client who had dismissed her that day. How could she challenge those assumptions and help them see past their own prejudices? The CEO spent the next few days reflecting on these questions. She knew that there was no quick fix, no magic solution that would immediately solve all the issues. But she also knew that change was possible. It would require patience, hard work, and a commitment to continuous improvement. She had built this business with a vision of success, but now she had a new vision. A dealership where everyone felt respected, where biases were challenged, and where diversity was not just accepted but celebrated. She began brainstorming ways to address the issues she had uncovered. The first step, she realized, was to implement mandatory sensitivity training for all employees. It would focus not just on racial biases, but also on gender, socioeconomic status, and other factors that shaped how people were treated. She also wanted to create a more inclusive hiring process, ensuring that the dealership's staff was as diverse as the community it served. But she knew that these changes were only the beginning. She would need to lead by example, creating a culture of accountability and respect that permeated every aspect of the business. Another priority was improving customer experience. She wanted to make sure that every customer, regardless of their background, felt welcomed and valued from the moment they walked in. That meant addressing the subtle biases that were present in the interactions between her staff and the customers. She began drafting a new set of customer service guidelines that emphasized respect, inclusivity, and kindness. But she also wanted to take it a step further. She envisioned a dealership where the customer experience went beyond just buying a car. It was about creating long-lasting relationships, about showing that everyone, regardless of race or background, mattered. The CEO also recognized the importance of transparency. She knew that it wasn't enough to make changes behind closed doors. She had to involve her employees and customers in the process. She decided to host an all-staff meeting where she would openly discuss the issues she had discovered and the steps the dealership would take to address them. She also planned to reach out to her customers, explaining the changes the dealership was making and inviting them to be a part of the conversation. As she reflected on the situation, the CEO realized that the experience, though painful, had been a gift. It had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths, but it had also given her the clarity and motivation she needed to create real change. She wasn't just the CEO of a successful business. She was a leader who had the power to make a difference. And that's exactly what she intended to do. She looked out the window once more, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready for the challenge. This was just the beginning. The future of her dealership and the future of her community depended on the actions she took now. Danielle did not raise her voice. She did not insult anyone. She did not celebrate what had just happened. Instead, she stood quietly for a moment, letting the room settle. The showroom that had been loud just minutes earlier now felt heavy and uncomfortable. Every employee nearby could feel that something important was about to happen. She first asked the general manager to escort the client outside so the rest of the customers would not be disturbed. The client tried one last time to speak, but the manager politely stopped him and guided him away. The glass doors closed behind them and the sound echoed through the showroom. That moment alone sent a clear message: behavior has consequences. Danielle then turned to the employees. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked nervous, unsure of what to expect. She asked everyone working that shift to gather near the center of the showroom. Her voice was calm, steady, and clear. She told them she did not come there that day to embarrass anyone. She came to understand what customers truly experience when they walk into that building. She explained that leadership cannot fix problems it never sees. Reports and numbers do not always show how people are treated in real life. She spoke about respect. She said respect should never be based on how someone looks, what they wear, or what people assume about them. Every customer who walks through the door deserves the same attention, the same patience, and the same dignity. Danielle pointed out that what hurt her the most was not the rude behavior of one client. It was the silence that followed. No one stepped in. No one asked if she was okay. No one tried to correct the situation. That silence, she explained, can be just as damaging as open disrespect. She reminded them that a workplace culture is built in small moments. It is built when someone chooses to speak up. It is built when someone decides to treat others fairly even when it is uncomfortable. And it is damaged when people look the other way. The general manager apologized publicly. He admitted that he reacted based on assumption instead of listening. He took responsibility for not handling the situation properly from the start. Danielle accepted the apology, but made it clear that words alone were not enough. She announced that changes would begin immediately. All staff members would go through updated training focused on customer respect, fairness, and professional conduct. Not as a punishment, but as a reset. She wanted everyone to understand expectations clearly. Danielle also introduced a new policy that encouraged employees to step in when they see unfair treatment. She explained that speaking up would never be punished when done respectfully. In fact, it would be supported. Leadership, she said, is not just a title. It is a behavior. She shared a personal story from earlier in her career. She talked about walking into offices where people assumed she was in the wrong place. She talked about being overlooked, questioned, and underestimated. Those experiences, she explained, shaped her vision for her company. She wanted to build spaces where people felt seen, not judged. The room grew quieter as people listened. Some employees nodded. A few looked emotional. For many of them, this was the first time they had heard leadership speak so honestly about real experiences. Danielle made it clear that accountability would be fair and balanced. The incident would be reviewed, not to blame, but to learn. Individual coaching would be provided where needed. Expectations would be reinforced at every level, including management. Before ending the meeting, she thanked the staff for listening. She reminded them that every day is a chance to do better than the day before. She did not threaten jobs. She did not shame anyone. She focused on growth. Later that evening, Danielle stayed after closing hours. She walked through the dealership one last time, speaking one-on-one with a few employees who had questions or concerns. She listened more than she talked. She wanted them to know that leadership was accessible, not distant. Over the following weeks, noticeable changes began to appear. Customers were greeted more evenly. Staff members worked together more closely. Managers paid closer attention to how situations were handled on the floor. The environment slowly became warmer and more professional. Word spread quietly among employees that the company owner truly cared, not just about profits, but about people. That belief changed how they showed up to work each day. As for the client who had caused the incident, he never returned. The dealership did not lose business because of it. In fact, customer satisfaction improved. People felt more comfortable. Trust grew. Danielle later reflected on that day as a reminder of why she chose to lead the way she does. Real leadership, she believed, is not about power. It is about responsibility. It is about setting standards even when no one expects you to. The experience strengthened her commitment to creating spaces where respect is the rule, not the exception. And while the moment was uncomfortable, it became a turning point that made the company stronger. In the end, no dramatic speech or public punishment defined the outcome. What mattered was the quiet work that followed, the listening, the learning, the willingness to change. That day proved something important. When leadership shows up with clarity and fairness, real change is possible. And sometimes, the strongest message is delivered not through anger, but through calm, steady accountability.